I never thought I'd be the type of person to question family loyalty. Growing up in rural Tennessee, family was everything. Blood runs thicker than water, honor your elders, all those values that seemed carved into the very hills surrounding our property. But sometimes life has a way of showing you that the people you trust most can become the ones who hurt you deepest. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how I learned that protecting what matters most sometimes means standing alone against the very people who should have stood with me. 6 months ago, I buried my father, Thomas Mitchell, on a grey October morning that felt like the world itself was mourning. Dad wasn't just my father, he was my anchor, my moral compass, the man who taught me that integrity isn't just about doing the right thing when people are watching, but especially when they're not. He was a quiet man, never one for grand gestures or flowery speeches, but his presence filled every room he entered. The funeral was small, intimate, the way he would have wanted it. My cousin Brandon gave a eulogy that made everyone cry, talking about Uncle Thomas's generosity and how he'd always been there for the family. My Aunt Margaret, Brandon's mother, sat in the front pew, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, the picture of grief. I remember thinking how grateful I was to have family during such a difficult time. Dad had been sick for almost 2 years before he passed. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that takes you slowly, giving you just enough time to say goodbye, but not enough to feel ready. During those final months, we'd spent countless hours together on the land he loved so much. 300 acres of rolling hills, dense woods and open meadows that had been in our family for 4 generations. He'd walk me through every boundary marker, every significant tree, every story the land held. "This place has been good to us, Sarah," he'd say, his voice growing weaker but never less certain. "It's given us everything we needed, asked for nothing but respect in return. One day, it'll be yours to protect." I knew he was dying, but I wasn't prepared for how quiet the house would become without him. The silence wasn't just the absence of his voice, it was the absence of his presence, the way he'd hum old country songs while making morning coffee, the sound of his boots on the front porch as he checked the weather each dawn. The will reading happened a week after the funeral. Dad's lawyer, Mr. James Harrison, had been handling our family's legal affairs for 30 years. He was a soft-spoken man with kind eyes and the patience of someone who'd spent decades helping families navigate their most difficult moments. "Thomas was very clear about his wishes," Mr. Harrison said, adjusting his glasses as he opened the file. "The land, all 300 acres, goes to his daughter, Sarah Mitchell, along with the house and all associated property." I wasn't surprised. Dad and I had talked about it many times. I was his only child, and I'd been the one caring for him during his illness. I'd taken leave from my job as a high school history teacher to be with him during his final months. The land meant everything to him, and he knew it meant everything to me too. Aunt Margaret and Brandon were there for the reading, along with a few other distant relatives. I expected some questions. Inheritance always brings out complicated emotions, but everyone seemed to accept Dad's decision with grace. Brandon even hugged me afterward, saying, "Uncle Thomas knew you'd take good care of the place." What I didn't know was that acceptance would be short-lived. 3 weeks after the funeral, I had to travel to Nashville for a teaching conference. It was my first time leaving town since Dad's death, and I felt guilty going, even though I knew it was necessary. I was trying to rebuild my life, to find some sense of normalcy after months of watching someone I loved slowly slip away. The conference was about incorporating local history into curriculum, something I'd always been passionate about. I'd even planned to develop a unit about our area's agricultural heritage, using Dad's land as a case study. The irony of that plan would become clear soon enough. I was in the middle of a workshop on primary source documents when my phone buzzed. Mrs. Helen Crawford, our neighbor of 20 years, was calling. Helen was one of those people who knew everything that happened in our small community before it happened, but she wasn't a gossip in the malicious sense. She genuinely cared about her neighbors. "Sarah, honey, I hate to bother you, but I need to ask you something," she said, her voice carrying a tension I'd never heard before. "There are people measuring your dad's land, men with surveying equipment, walking the property lines. Are you selling it?" My heart stopped. "What? No, absolutely not. I'm not selling anything." "Well, there's a for sale sign at the main entrance, and I saw Margaret and Brandon talking to the real estate agent this morning. I thought maybe you'd changed your mind, but something felt off about it." The world tilted. I felt like I was falling through space, my mind struggling to process what Helen was telling me. "Helen, I'm in Nashville. I'll be back tonight. Can you keep an eye on things?" "Of course, dear. I'll call you if anything else happens." The 3-hour drive home felt like the longest of my life. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I tried to make sense of what was happening. How could there be a for sale sign on my property? How could Margaret and Brandon be talking to real estate agents about land they didn't own? I called Mr. Harrison from the road, but his office was closed. I left a voicemail that probably sounded as frantic as I felt. Then I called Margaret directly. "Oh, Sarah, you're back early," she said when she answered, her voice carrying a strange mix of surprise and something else. Guilt, maybe. "Margaret, what's going on with Dad's land? Helen said there are surveyors and a for sale sign." There was a pause that stretched too long. "Well, honey, we need to talk. Brandon and I have been going through some of your father's papers, and we found something important. Can you come over?" I drove straight to Margaret's house, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe there was some misunderstanding. Maybe the surveyors were working on the adjacent property. Maybe the for sale sign was some kind of mistake. Margaret's house was a modest ranch-style home, about 10 miles from Dad's place. She'd lived there for 15 years, ever since her divorce, and Brandon had moved back in with her after losing his job at the furniture factory. When I arrived, they were both sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out between them. "Sarah, sit down," Margaret said, gesturing to the empty chair across from them. "We need to show you something." Brandon looked uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes as he pushed a document across the table. Uncle Thomas changed his will about a month before he died. He left the land to both of us, me and Mom. It's all here. I stared at the papers, my vision blurring as I tried to focus on the words. It looked official, legal letterhead, signatures, notary stamps. But something felt wrong. The language was different from what I remembered of Dad's usual way of speaking, more formal and cold. "This doesn't make sense," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Dad never mentioned changing his will. We talked about the land constantly during his last months." Margaret leaned forward, her expression a mix of sympathy and determination. "Thomas was very sick toward the end, Sarah. Sometimes people make decisions when they're not thinking clearly. Maybe he felt guilty about leaving you with such a big responsibility. Or maybe he realized the land would be better managed by someone with business experience," Brandon added, his voice gaining confidence. "I've been looking into the property values and we could get a good price for it, enough to set us all up comfortably." I felt like I was drowning. The room seemed to spin as I tried to process what they were saying. Dad, who had spent his entire life on that land, who had talked about it with such love and reverence even as he was dying, had supposedly decided to sell it. "I need to see the original," I said, standing up abruptly. "I need to talk to Mr. Harrison." "Sarah, honey, we know this is hard," Margaret said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that I'd never heard from her before. "But you have to accept that things have changed. The land is going to be sold, and we'll split the proceeds fairly." I left without another word, my mind reeling as I drove home. The house felt different now, not just empty, but violated somehow. I spent the night pacing the floors, going through Dad's papers, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. The next morning, I called Mr. Harrison as soon as his office opened. His secretary, Mrs. Williams, had been with him for decades and knew our family well. "Sarah, I'm so sorry about what you're going through," she said when I explained the situation. "Mr. Harrison will want to see those documents immediately. Can you bring them in this afternoon?" The meeting with Mr. Harrison was like stepping into a different reality. He examined the papers Margaret and Brandon had shown me, his expression growing more serious with each page. "Sarah, I need to be very clear about something," he said finally. "These documents are forgeries. Quite sophisticated ones, but forgeries nonetheless. Your father never changed his will. The last modification was made 3 years ago, when he updated his executor instructions." I felt relief and rage in equal measure. Relief that my father hadn't betrayed my trust. Rage that my own family had tried to steal from me using fake documents. "What can we do?" I asked. "Legally, we have several options, but first we need to stop any sale proceedings immediately. I'll contact the real estate agent and inform them that the property is not legally for sale." Over the next few days, the situation escalated quickly. Margaret and Brandon hired their own lawyer, insisting their documents were legitimate. They filed a claim against the estate, forcing everything into legal limbo while the courts sorted out the truth. It was during this time that I remembered something Dad had said to me about a year before he died. We'd been sitting on the front porch watching the sunset paint the hills gold when he suddenly got up and went into the house. He came back with a sealed envelope. "Sarah, I want you to keep this somewhere safe," he said, his voice more serious than usual. "Only open it if someone tries to take the land. Promise me." I'd tucked the envelope into my jewelry box and forgotten about it until now. My hands trembled as I broke the seal and pulled out 2 documents. A handwritten letter in Dad's careful script, and an original deed with my name on it, dated just 2 months before his death. The letter was brief, but devastating. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then someone has tried to challenge your inheritance of our land. I've prepared this deed as extra protection because I know how much this property means to you, and I know you'll protect it the way it deserves. Margaret and Brandon have been asking me about the land's value for months, suggesting I should sell it for everyone's benefit. I've seen the way they look at it, not as a home, but as a commodity. You look at it the way I do, the way my father did, and his father before him. The land chose you, Sarah, just as it chose me. Trust that, and trust yourself. All my love, Dad." I sat on my bedroom floor and cried until I had no tears left. Then I called Mr. Harrison. "Sarah, this changes everything," he said after I read him the letter. "This deed is properly notarized and witnessed. It actually supersedes the will in terms of property transfer. Your father was incredibly thorough. What does this mean for Margaret and Brandon's claim? It means their case just became impossible to win, but more importantly, it means we can resolve this without a lengthy court battle. Are you willing to confront them directly?" I thought about it for a long moment. Part of me wanted to let the lawyers handle everything, to avoid the emotional confrontation. But another part of me, the part that sounded like Dad's voice, knew that this needed to be settled face to face. "Yes," I said, "but I want it done properly. Can we arrange a meeting with a notary present?" 3 days later, we met at Mr. Harrison's office. Margaret and Brandon arrived with their lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They were confident, almost smug, as they settled into their chairs. "I hope you've come to your senses, Sarah," Margaret said. "We're prepared to be generous with the division of proceeds." I placed the sealed envelope on the conference table. "Before we discuss anything, I have something I need to share." The notary, Mrs. Patricia Webb, was a woman in her 50s, with the kind of authoritative presence that comes from years of witnessing people's most important moments. She broke the seal and examined the documents carefully. "These appear to be genuine," she said. "Mr. Mitchell, would you like me to read the contents aloud?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. Mrs. Webb's clear, professional tone filled the room as she read Dad's letter. I watched Margaret's face go pale, saw Brandon's confident expression crumble into something like panic. Additionally, Mrs. Webb continued, there is a property deed transferring full ownership of the land to Sarah Mitchell, dated and notarized 2 months before Thomas Mitchell's death. This deed takes precedence over any will provisions. Brandon's lawyer was already shuffling through his papers, clearly recognizing that his client's case had just evaporated. Margaret stared at the documents as if they might disappear if she looked hard enough. "This is impossible," she whispered. "Thomas never said anything about this." "He did," I said quietly. "He told me he was protecting the land from people who saw it as nothing more than money." The room was silent except for the sound of Brandon's lawyer packing up his briefcase. Margaret looked at me with something I'd never seen in her eyes before. Not just anger, but a kind of desperate betrayal, as if I were the one who had deceived her. "You've destroyed this family," she said, her voice shaking. "Your father would be ashamed of what you've done." For a moment her words hit me like a physical blow, but then I remembered the letter, Dad's careful explanation of why he'd taken such precautions. I stood up slowly, gathering the documents. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "Dad protected what he loved from people who would have destroyed it. He chose me because he knew I would do the same." I thanked Mrs. Webb and Mr. Harrison and walked out of the office into the bright afternoon sunshine. Behind me, I could hear Margaret crying and Brandon's voice raised in anger, but I didn't look back. The legal resolution was swift after that. Margaret and Brandon dropped their claim, and the fake documents were turned over to the district attorney's office. Their lawyer quietly withdrew from the case, probably relieved to be done with what had become an obvious fraud. But the personal resolution was more complicated. Word traveled fast in our small community, and people took sides. Some supported me, understanding that I'd been the victim of a betrayal. Others felt I should have been more generous, that family should come before legal technicalities. Margaret and Brandon stopped speaking to me entirely. At first this hurt more than I expected. Despite everything they'd done, they were still family, and I'd lost them along with Dad. But as weeks passed, I began to understand that they'd never really been the people I thought they were. The land, though, the land was exactly as Dad had left it. Every Sunday I walked the property lines, checking on the old oak tree where he used to sit and think, visiting the creek where he taught me to fish, standing in the meadow where he'd told me stories about his own childhood. The peace I find there is different now. It's not just the natural tranquility of the hills and woods, it's the peace of knowing I fought for something worth fighting for. Dad had seen this confrontation coming and had prepared me for it in his own quiet way. I've started teaching again, but I've also begun developing that curriculum unit about local agricultural heritage. The land serves as a living classroom where my students can learn about sustainable farming, family history, and the importance of preserving rural traditions. Sometimes I wonder if I could have handled things differently, if there was a way to maintain family relationships while still protecting Dad's wishes. But then I remember Margaret's words, "Your father would be ashamed." And I know that bridge was burned from the moment they decided to forge documents and lie to me. The hardest part isn't the isolation from extended family. It's the realization that people you love and trust can become strangers when money is involved. Margaret had been like a second mother to me growing up, and Brandon had been more like a brother than a cousin. Losing them felt like losing pieces of my own history, but I've also learned something about resilience that I never knew I possessed. Standing up to family requires a different kind of courage than standing up to strangers. It means choosing principles over comfort, truth over peace, integrity over belonging. The land has become my sanctuary in ways I never expected. It's where I go to think through problems, where I find the strength to face difficult days, where I feel most connected to Dad's memory. He was right. The land chose me, and I chose it back. There are mornings when I walk through the woods and find myself having conversations with Dad, telling him about the students who visited, the conservation efforts I'm planning, the way the property changes with each season. I think he'd be proud of the choices I've made, even the painful ones. I've also learned that protecting what matters most sometimes means standing alone, but it doesn't mean being alone. New relationships have formed, with neighbors who respect what I'm doing, with students who are fascinated by the land's history, with other people who understand that some things are worth more than money. The real estate market in our area has continued to grow, and I still get calls from developers interested in the property. Each call is a reminder of what Margaret and Brandon saw when they looked at the land, dollar signs and opportunity. But when I look at it, I see responsibility, legacy, and home. Last month, I had the property officially designated as a conservation easement, which means it can never be developed, regardless of who owns it in the future. It was a decision Dad would have loved, ensuring that the land will remain protected for generations to come. The legal battles are over, but the personal journey continues. I'm still learning how to navigate life without Dad's guidance, how to make decisions that honor his memory while building my own future. The land has become my teacher in ways I never expected, showing me that strength can grow from the deepest soil, that roots can survive even the harshest winters. Some people might say I should have compromised, that I should have found a way to share the inheritance or at least maintain family relationships. But I've learned that some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, and some trusts, once broken, can never be fully repaired. The Sunday visits to the land have become a ritual that grounds me, a way of staying connected to Dad's memory and to the values he taught me. It's peaceful there, but it's a peace I had to fight for, a peace that came at the cost of family relationships I thought were unbreakable. I think about the person I was before all this happened, someone who believed that family loyalty was unconditional, that blood really was thicker than water. I was naive in some ways, unprepared for the reality that people can change when they see something they want badly enough. But I was also stronger than I knew. The courage to stand up to Margaret and Brandon, to fight for what Dad had left me, came from somewhere deep inside, a well of strength I didn't know existed until I needed it. The land continues to teach me lessons about resilience, about the importance of deep roots, about the way living things adapt and survive, even in difficult conditions. Every season brings new growth, new challenges, new opportunities to learn and change. I'm not the same person I was before Dad died, before the betrayal, before the fight for the land. I'm sadder in some ways, more aware of how quickly relationships can change, how easily trust can be broken. But I'm also stronger, more confident in my ability to stand up for what matters, more certain of my own values. The land chose me, just as Dad said it would, and I chose it back, with all the complications and sacrifices that choice required. It's a choice I make again every Sunday when I walk those familiar paths, every time I turn down an offer to sell, every time I remember why this place matters more than money. This is my story of betrayal and resilience, of family loyalty tested and personal strength discovered. It's a story that continues to unfold with each passing season, each new challenge, each moment of peace I find in the place my father loved enough to protect for me. The land that chose me has become the foundation of who I am now, not just a property owner, but a guardian of something precious, a protector of legacy, a woman who learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought with the people closest to you. And in the end, that's exactly what Dad knew I would need to become. The months following the legal resolution brought unexpected revelations about family dynamics I'd never fully understood. As I sifted through Dad's personal papers, letters, journals, old photographs, I began to see patterns of behavior that had been invisible to me before. Margaret's resentment wasn't new. It had been building for years, perhaps decades. In a letter Dad had written to his own father, but never sent, dated 15 years earlier, he mentioned feeling concerned about Margaret's increasing bitterness toward the family's financial situation. She'd been struggling since her divorce, and Brandon had been unable to find steady work. Dad had helped them financially many times over the years, but apparently it had never been enough. Margaret seems to believe the family owes her something, Dad had written. She looks at this land and sees money that should be hers. She doesn't understand that selling it would be like selling our history, our identity. I worry about what she might do if she ever gets desperate enough. Reading those words, I felt a chill of recognition. Dad had seen this coming years before it happened. He'd been preparing for this betrayal not just in the legal documents he'd arranged, but in the way he'd raised me, teaching me to value things that couldn't be bought or sold. I found other evidence of his foresight, copies of property tax records he'd kept meticulously, documentation of every improvement made to the land, even photographs of boundary markers taken from multiple angles. He'd been building a case for my inheritance long before he'd ever gotten sick. But perhaps the most revealing discovery was a series of emails between Dad and Brandon from 2 years before his death. Brandon had been pressuring him to consider selling portions of the land to developers, arguing that the family could benefit from the profits. Dad's responses were patient but firm, explaining over and over why the land needed to stay intact. "You see acreage, Brandon," Dad had written in one email. "I see watershed, wildlife corridors, soil that's been building for centuries. Sarah sees what I see. That's why she's the one who'll protect it." Brandon's responses grew increasingly frustrated, eventually turning nasty. In his final email, he'd written, "You're being selfish, Uncle Thomas. You're choosing that damn dirt over your own family's future." Dad's response was a single sentence: "I'm choosing the future over immediate gratification." These discoveries helped me understand that the betrayal I'd experienced wasn't spontaneous. It was the culmination of years of growing resentment and entitlement. Margaret and Brandon hadn't just seen an opportunity when Dad died. They'd been planning their move for a long time, but understanding their motivations didn't make the betrayal hurt less. If anything, it made it worse. They'd sat at Dad's funeral, hugged me, comforted me, all while planning to steal from me. The manipulation felt more calculated, more cruel than I'd originally realized. The isolation from extended family became more complete as word spread about what had happened. Some relatives took Margaret and Brandon's side, believing their version of events, that I'd been greedy and uncompromising, that I'd destroyed family unity over money. Others stayed neutral, unwilling to get involved in what they saw as a family dispute. Only a few people understood what had really happened, and even fewer were willing to speak up about it. The silence was deafening, a reminder that family loyalty often flows in only one direction. I began to understand something profound about human nature during this period. People will often support the version of events that makes them most comfortable, regardless of the truth. It was easier for some family members to believe that I'd been unreasonable than to accept that Margaret and Brandon had committed fraud. This realization was both heartbreaking and liberating. Heartbreaking because it meant losing people I'd loved and trusted. Liberating because it freed me from the need to justify my actions to people who had already decided not to understand them. The land became my refuge during this time of emotional upheaval. I started spending entire days there, sometimes sleeping in the old hunting cabin Dad had built in the woods. It was there, surrounded by the sounds of nature and the memories of conversations with Dad, that I began to heal. I also began to see the land differently. Before, it had been primarily a connection to family history, a legacy to preserve. Now it became a symbol of personal strength, of my ability to fight for what mattered. Every tree, every stream, every meadow represented a victory over people who had tried to take something precious from me. The teaching job I'd returned to after Dad's death became both a challenge and a blessing. Some days I struggled to focus on lesson plans and student needs when my personal life felt like it was falling apart. But other days, being in the classroom reminded me that I had value beyond my inheritance, that I was building something meaningful with my life. My students, with their honest questions and genuine curiosity, helped me process what I'd been through. When I told them about developing the local history curriculum using my family's land, they were fascinated by the idea of learning from a place that had been in one family for generations. "How do you know so much about the land?" one student asked during a field trip to the property. "Because I've been listening to it my whole life," I replied. "And because my father taught me that if you pay attention, the land will tell you its stories." That conversation sparked something in me. I began to see my role not just as a protector of the land, but as a translator of its history. I started documenting everything Dad had taught me, the stories of previous generations, the changes the land had witnessed, the lessons it offered about resilience and adaptation. This documentation process became a form of therapy. Writing down Dad's stories helped me feel connected to him, while also creating a record that future generations could learn from. I was transforming grief into purpose, turning personal pain into something that could benefit others. The conservation easement I'd established was just the beginning. I began working with local environmental groups to use the land as an educational resource. High school students came to study ecosystems and wildlife. College students researched sustainable agriculture practices. Historians documented the cultural significance of the property. Each group of visitors brought new perspectives and questions that challenged me to think more deeply about the land's significance. I wasn't just preserving a family legacy, I was creating a living laboratory for understanding how humans and nature can coexist. The financial aspect of maintaining the property without selling it required creative solutions. I started offering guided tours for history buffs interested in learning about 19th century farming practices. I partnered with the local university to host archaeology digs that might uncover artifacts from the property's early days. These activities generated modest income while also serving educational purposes. More importantly, they connected me with people who shared my values, who understood that some things are worth more than money. One afternoon, while leading a tour for a group of environmental science students, I found myself standing in the exact spot where Dad had given me that sealed envelope. The memory hit me with unexpected force, not just the sadness of his death, but the profound love and foresight he'd shown in protecting me. "This is where my father told me the land would choose me," I said to the students. At the time, I thought it was just a poetic way of talking about inheritance. Now I understand he was talking about responsibility, about being worthy of something precious. One student, a young woman about my age when I'd first lost Dad, raised her hand. "How do you know if you're worthy of something like this?" The question stopped me cold. How did I know? What made me more deserving than Margaret or Brandon? The answer came slowly, not from my mind, but from somewhere deeper. "I think worthiness isn't about deserving something," I said finally. "It's about being willing to sacrifice for it. My father knew I would give up money, family relationships, even my own comfort to protect this place. Margaret and Brandon saw it as something they could profit from. The difference isn't in what we deserved, but in what we were willing to give." That conversation stayed with me long after the students left. It helped me understand that my fight for the land hadn't been about proving I deserved it. It had been about proving I would protect it. Dad had chosen me not because I was his only child, but because I was the person who would make the sacrifices necessary to preserve what he loved. The second year after Dad's death brought new challenges and new growth. I decided to pursue a master's degree in environmental education, studying part-time while continuing to teach and manage the land. The program forced me to think more systematically about conservation, about the intersection of human needs and environmental protection. My thesis project focused on the educational potential of family-owned agricultural land, using Dad's property as a case study. The research required me to dive deep into the history of the land, interviewing elderly neighbors who remembered my great-grandfather, studying old maps and documents, piecing together a comprehensive picture of how the land had changed over time. What I discovered was remarkable. The land had been a model of sustainable agriculture for generations, supporting diverse crops and livestock while maintaining healthy soil and water systems. My great-grandfather had been ahead of his time in understanding the importance of crop rotation and natural pest management. Dad had continued these practices, but he'd also adapted them for changing times. He'd reforested areas that had been over-farmed, created wildlife corridors that connected fragmented habitats, and maintained water quality that surpassed state standards. Understanding this history helped me see that I wasn't just preserving a family legacy. I was protecting a working example of sustainable land management. The land had been choosing responsible stewards for generations, and I was simply the latest in that line. The thesis project also brought me into contact with other landowners facing similar challenges. Many of them were struggling with family members who wanted to sell agricultural land to developers or dealing with the financial pressures of maintaining large properties without steady income. I began speaking at conferences about the importance of keeping agricultural land in family hands, about the educational value of preserved landscapes, about the strategies I'd developed for making conservation financially viable. These speaking engagements connected me with a community of people who shared my values and understood my challenges. One of the most meaningful connections came through a conference in Kentucky, where I met Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a professor of agricultural history who had grown up on a family farm in California. She'd faced similar pressures to sell when her parents died, but had found ways to keep the land while also using it for research and education. The hardest part isn't the money, she told me over coffee after my presentation. It's the loneliness. When you choose land over immediate profit, you're often choosing a path that your family and friends don't understand. Her words resonated deeply. The loneliness was real, but so was the sense of purpose that came from protecting something meaningful. We stayed in touch, sharing strategies and offering support when the isolation became overwhelming. Through these connections, I began to understand that my experience wasn't unique. All across the country, people were facing similar choices between immediate profit and long-term stewardship. Some chose money, others chose preservation, but all of them were grappling with the same fundamental question: what do we owe to future generations? The third year brought a new development that tested my resolve in unexpected ways. A major corporation announced plans to build a distribution center on land adjacent to Dad's property. The development would bring jobs to the area, but it would also increase traffic, noise, and pollution. Some neighbors supported the development, seeing it as an economic opportunity. Others opposed it, worried about the environmental impact. I found myself in the middle, trying to balance the community's need for economic growth with my commitment to preserving the land's character. The situation became more complicated when the corporation's representatives approached me directly. They wanted to buy a small portion of my land to create a buffer zone between the distribution center and the surrounding residential areas. The offer was substantial, enough to solve any financial concerns I might have about maintaining the property. For the first time since Dad's death, I seriously considered selling part of the land. The money would have made everything easier, and the portion they wanted wasn't particularly significant in terms of the property's ecological or historical value. But when I walked that section of land, imagining it bulldozed and paved, I felt sick. It wasn't just about the land itself, it was about the precedent it would set. Once I started selling pieces, where would it end? How would I explain to future generations that I'd compromised the very thing I'd fought so hard to protect? I declined the offer, but the decision wasn't easy. It forced me to confront the reality that protecting the land would require constant vigilance, that there would always be new pressures to compromise. The corporation's development proceeded without my land, but it changed the character of the area. The increased traffic made my Sunday walks less peaceful, and the lights from the facility were visible from the highest points on the property. It was a reminder that conservation isn't just about protecting individual properties. It's about maintaining the broader landscape that gives those properties meaning. This experience taught me about the interconnectedness of environmental protection. My land was more valuable because it was part of a larger ecosystem, but that ecosystem was vulnerable to changes beyond my control. It reinforced my commitment to working with others who shared my values, to building coalitions that could address challenges bigger than any individual property. The fourth year brought unexpected validation for the choices I'd made. A team of researchers from the State University published a study identifying my property as one of the most ecologically significant privately owned lands in the region. The diverse habitats, healthy water systems, and sustainable management practices had created a kind of biological island in an increasingly developed landscape. The study's lead researcher, Dr. Michael Chen, contacted me about establishing a long-term research partnership. His team wanted to use the land as a baseline for studying environmental changes in the region, documenting how different management practices affected biodiversity and ecosystem health. "Properties like yours are becoming increasingly rare," he told me during our first meeting. "The continuity of management, the diversity of habitats, the lack of chemical inputs. It's exactly what we need to understand how landscapes can be both productive and ecologically healthy." The research partnership brought new energy and purpose to my work. Graduate students established monitoring plots throughout the property, tracking everything from soil health to bird populations. Their findings consistently showed that Dad's management practices had created remarkably healthy ecosystems. But perhaps more importantly, the research validated my decision to fight for the land. It proved that Dad's vision of sustainable stewardship had been scientifically sound, that the land really was worth protecting for reasons beyond family sentiment. The validation was especially meaningful because it came from outside the family conflicts that had torn us apart. These researchers didn't care about inheritance disputes or family loyalty. They cared about ecological integrity and scientific value. Their enthusiasm for the land confirmed that I'd been fighting for something genuinely important. The research partnership also provided new opportunities for education and outreach. The data collected on the property became the basis for academic papers, conference presentations, and educational materials. I co-authored several articles about the relationship between family land tenure and conservation outcomes. This academic work connected me with a broader community of scholars and practitioners who were grappling with similar questions about land use, conservation, and family dynamics. It was gratifying to discover that my personal struggle had broader implications for understanding how societies can balance individual rights with collective environmental needs. The fifth year brought a development that forced me to confront the limits of my own perspective. Brandon, whom I hadn't spoken to since the confrontation in the lawyer's office, reached out through a mutual friend. He wanted to meet, to apologize, to try to rebuild some kind of relationship. Part of me wanted to refuse. The betrayal had been so complete, so calculated, that I couldn't imagine trusting him again. But another part of me was curious about what had changed, what had prompted him to reach out after years of silence. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in town, far from the land that had become the symbol of our conflict. Brandon looked older, more tired than I remembered. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine regret. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said, staring into his coffee cup. "About what we did. It was wrong, Sarah. I know that now." I waited for him to continue, not sure what I wanted to hear. I was so focused on the money, on solving our financial problems, that I convinced myself Uncle Thomas didn't really mean to leave everything to you. I told myself he was just being sentimental, that he didn't understand the practical implications. "So you decided to forge documents and lie to me?" He winced. "Mom was desperate. She was about to lose the house and I couldn't find work. When we saw how much the land was worth, it felt like the answer to everything. I told myself we were just taking what should have been ours anyway. The explanation didn't excuse what they'd done, but it helped me understand their motivations. They'd been drowning, and the land had looked like a life preserver. They'd been wrong to try to take it, but their desperation had been real. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Brandon continued. "I know I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that I understand now why Uncle Thomas chose you. You see the land the way he did. I never could. The conversation was both painful and cathartic. It didn't repair our relationship. Too much damage had been done for that, but it provided a kind of closure. Brandon's acknowledgement that Dad had made the right choice validated my fight in a way that legal victories never could. We parted cordially, but without any illusion that we could return to being family. Too much had happened. Too much trust had been broken. But the conversation helped me understand that holding on to anger was more harmful to me than to him. The 6th year brought a new challenge that tested everything I'd learned about resilience and adaptation. Climate change was affecting the region in ways that traditional farming practices couldn't address. Extended droughts stressed the water systems Dad had carefully maintained, while intense storms caused erosion problems that threatened the land's long-term health. I found myself having to make difficult decisions about how to adapt Dad's conservation practices to changing conditions. Some of the tree species he'd planted were struggling with the hotter, drier conditions. Traditional crop rotations weren't working as well as they had in the past. Working with Dr. Chen and his research team, I began experimenting with new approaches to land management. We planted drought-resistant native species, adjusted water management systems, and modified agricultural practices to better suit changing conditions. The process was humbling. It forced me to accept that even the most carefully preserved landscapes couldn't remain static. Conservation wasn't just about maintaining what Dad had created, it was about helping the land adapt to new challenges while maintaining its essential character. This realization changed how I thought about my role as a steward. I wasn't just a guardian of the past, but a facilitator of adaptation. The land was still choosing me, but it was asking me to help it change in ways that would ensure its survival. The climate challenges also reinforced the importance of the conservation easement I'd established. As other landowners in the area struggled with similar issues, some were tempted to sell to developers who promised to solve their problems. The legal protection I'd put in place ensured that my land would remain protected regardless of what challenges the future might bring. The 7th year brought a personal development that surprised everyone who knew me. I met someone who understood and supported my commitment to the land. Dr. James Parker was a wildlife biologist who'd been part of one of the research teams studying the property. He'd grown up on a farm in Montana and had his own complicated relationship with family land. Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than romance. He understood why I'd fought for the land, why I'd sacrificed family relationships to protect it. More importantly, he shared my vision of what the land could become. "You're not just preserving the past," he told me during one of our walks through the woods. "You're creating a model for how people can live responsibly with the land. That's something worth fighting for." Having someone who truly understood my choices was profoundly healing. For years, I'd been defending my decisions to people who saw them as selfish or impractical. James saw them as necessary and admirable. Our relationship deepened my connection to the land in unexpected ways. Sharing it with someone who appreciated its beauty and significance made me see it through new eyes. We began planning long-term conservation strategies together, dreaming about how the land might continue to serve educational and research purposes for generations to come. The 8th year brought a full-circle moment that illuminated how much had changed since Dad's death. I was leading a group of environmental science students on a tour of the property when we encountered a family of deer grazing in the meadow where Dad and I had spent so many hours talking. One of the students asked about the challenges of maintaining such a large property alone. I found myself telling them about the inheritance dispute, about the difficult choice between family relationships and land preservation, about the years of isolation and doubt. "How do you know you made the right choice?" the student asked. I looked around at the healthy forest, the clear stream, the diverse wildlife, the research plots that were yielding important data about sustainable land management. I thought about the hundreds of students who had learned from the land, the scientific discoveries that had emerged from its preservation, the model it provided for responsible stewardship. "Because the land is still here," I said simply, "and it's still teaching us things we need to learn." That evening, I walked to the spot where Dad and I had sat during his final months, where he'd told me about the sealed envelope, where he'd explained that the land would choose me. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed to make the whole landscape glow. For the first time since his death, I felt completely at peace with the choices I'd made. The betrayal still hurt, the family relationships were still broken, but the land was thriving. It was educating young people, supporting important research, providing habitat for wildlife, and serving as a model for sustainable management. I thought about Dad's letter, about his prediction that I would see the land the way he did. He'd been right, but it had taken years of struggle and growth for me to fully understand what he'd meant. The land hadn't just chosen me, it had transformed me, teaching me about strength, resilience, and the importance of protecting what matters most. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, I made a promise to the land and to Dad's memory. I would continue fighting for this place, continue adapting to new challenges, continue sharing its lessons with anyone willing to learn. The land had chosen me, and I would spend the rest of my life proving worthy of that choice. The story continues to unfold with each passing season, each new challenge, each moment of peace I find in the place my father loved enough to protect for me. It's a story of betrayal and resilience, of family loyalty tested and personal strength discovered, of the profound connection between humans and the land that sustains us. Most importantly, it's a story about the courage required to protect what matters most, even when that protection comes at great personal cost. The land that chose me has become more than an inheritance. It's become a calling, a responsibility, and a source of strength that will guide me for the rest of my life.